The United States Air Force was just ordered to pay $230 million to the victims of the Sutherland Springs mass church shooting. In today's video, I'm going to be discussing the legal theories that the plaintiffs in this case used to prevail and providing my general legal analysis. What's going on, y'all? Attorney Tom here. In 2017, tragedy struck the small community of Sutherland Springs, Texas, a town located just outside of San Antonio, where an ex-Air Force member opened fire on the First Baptist Church of Sutherland Springs, killing more than 24 members of the congregation. After the dust had settled from this tragic incident, authorities and families of the victims looked for justice. The first question they asked is, was this preventable? And if so, how can we prevent this from ever happening again? Now, as it turns out, the shooter had pled guilty to multiple counts of assault during his time in the Air Force. Assault is a violent felony, and if you are convicted or have pled guilty to a violent crime of assault in most of the United States, you cannot own a firearm. Now, what had happened here is the shooter had these violent assaults, these guilty pleas on his record, but the United States Air Force failed to make a record or provide the record to the FBI background database. So when the shooter went to go purchase firearms in Texas, he did so legally. He went to an authorized vendor, they ran a background check, nothing showed up on his background check, and he was able to purchase the weapons which he used in the mass shooting. Now, to anybody who's been following this case, the award is actually not a shocker. In fact, in July of 2021, the court found liability on the Air Force. So it was only a matter of time. We knew that there was going to be a monetary award. We just didn't know how much. So we need to first take a step back from the monetary award, the $230 million. And now we need to talk about liability, how the court found liability. And as previously discussed, the theory of this case was negligent reporting, failing to report an incident. Now, what a lot of people in the comments are going to say is probably something to the effect of, oh, well, this guy's crazy. He was a shooter. He was going to get a gun anyway, whether or not the Air Force reported the crime or not. And that is, to an extent, the same argument that the government used, but that is not what the court found, and that is not what the evidence showed. All of the guns that were bought, used in the mass shooting, were obtained quote unquote legally. They ran a background check on him. And here's a quote from the judge. The trial conclusively established that no other individual, not even Kelly's own parents or partners, knew as much as the United States about the violence that Devin Kelly had threatened to commit and was capable of committing. Rodriguez's ruling read, moreover, the evidence shows that had the government done its job and properly reported Kelly's information into the background check system, it is more likely than not that Kelly would have been deterred from carrying out the church shooting. That is important. More likely than not. Preponderance of the evidence. Remember, this is a civil case. That is the standard. More likely than not. We don't need beyond a reasonable doubt. We need more likely than not. So, had he been not able to obtain a firearm legally, would he have gone through all the hassle of obtaining this massive armory of firearms to carry out this shooting? And the court found, more likely than not, that wouldn't have happened. Perhaps the most damning piece of evidence in this entire trial on liability was the fact that the United States Air Force took steps to protect itself. They didn't allow Kelly, they banned him from the Holman Air Force Base. They said, hey dude, you're too dangerous to even be around us. You cannot come in this base. Yet they failed to report him to the federal background check to the FBI. So ultimately, the trial court held that the United States Air Force was 60% responsible for this and found the shooter Kelly 40%. So 60-40, remember, preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not. So they have met their burden. The plaintiffs have met the burden of proof to establish liability on the United States Air Force. Now we have to talk about damages, which brings us back to that $230 million number. Now, according to this article here, the United States Air Force, in determining the damages, wanted to go off of a system used similar to the Victims' Compensation Fund of 9/11, where apparently in 9/11, every single person who was killed, got $250,000 plus $100,000 per extra dependent. So if they had 2 kids, another $200,000. They had a wife, another $100,000. They had a husband, another $100,000, just like that. However, this is a different situation. What the plaintiffs argued is said, hey, listen, this shouldn't be like the 9/11 monetary fund because there's fault assessed here. This is not just some tragedy that we had no control over. This was a preventable incident and they need to pay up. According to this article, the estates of those killed in the shooting were awarded between $5 and $7 million each for the pain and anguish the judge had determined the victims had likely suffered prior to their death. Several of the surviving victims were each awarded more than $10 million based on factors such as pain, anguish, physical impairment, medical expenses, and loss of future earnings. What's going on, y'all? Future attorney Tom here. I was filming that video, then I got a phone call, and then I had to go to work, and the day got away from me, and here I am myself to film the conclusion to this video. So ultimately, I think the $230 million verdict is a solid verdict. If any of y'all have watched my channel before, you know I'm a catastrophic personal injury lawyer. This is what I do for a living. And I often say I've never met a client or a victim of a catastrophic personal injury who'd rather have the money. If they could go back in time and have this never happen, they would pick that in a second. We know that's just not the case. And the other side of having a large jury verdict is, in theory, supposed to be deterrent. You want to make it so expensive for these defendants to commit these terrible acts of negligence that they go out of their way to prevent these things from happening again, because presumably they don't want to pay the money. Now, the big thing that I'm afraid of is when you're dealing with an entity like the Air Force, they pay $230 million. That's probably the cost of like a Raytheon missile. So I am just praying that on top of the families getting some sort of monetary compensation to move on with their life however best they can, that the Air Force takes some measures or issues some new procedures so something like this never happens again. Nobody at the Air Force is really going to feel that $230 million hole because it's not a for-profit company and nobody is going to be paying those expenses out of pocket. It is just a budget issue. If anything, it's just the taxpayers who are paying for it. So it's a hard balancing act to juggle because in theory, you could make that jury verdict billions of dollars with a B, and somebody at the Air Force still wouldn't feel that pain because it's, again, not their money. It's just the taxpayers' money. So ultimately, I think it is a solid result for the victims, again, under the circumstances. I just hope something changes. But I want to know what y'all's thoughts are. How much money would you have awarded if you were the judge in this case? All right, y'all. Talk to you later. Bye.
He's a catastrophic injury attorney who accidentally became a YouTuber. Attorney Tom.